All right, so welcome to the Cattlemen. We're sitting down with Wally Congdon. We're really excited that he has given us his time tonight to sit down with us. We're your hosts, Seth and Kimber King. And Wally, if you don't mind, to start out, kind of telling us about yourself, where you're from, and kind of your experience with Highland cattle so far.
So I'm a Montana kid, grew up. My mom's people all log and ranch, and my dad's people all are ministers or lawyers who farm as well.
Hmm.
So it's kind of in your blood on both sides in my family. We always have, we always did. That's okay. And that doesn't mean you don't go to school, don't get an education, but use both skill sets and do both of them. So that's what we still do after all these years. So we ran a lot of red Angus cows for a long time. And I had always kind of been interested in the Highland cows, but I really didn't do a whole lot of looking into them until I went to graduate school abroad. And so I went abroad. One of the kids in a room next door to me had gone to Wanganui Community College, which is a high school in New Zealand. They call colleges high schools colleges. So he went to Wanganui, and that was fine. And he said one day, "Well, you Americans are backwards. You do everything backwards." Andy tells me, my roommate, "You Americans drive on the wrong side of the road. You eat with your fork in the left wrong hand. You, of course, have your letters reversed in all your spelling, and you raise the wrong beef." To which I said, "Ian, what the hell are you talking about?" "No, that's what Andy told me. You Americans don't do it right." "Well, what's the deal?" "Well, Andy's family's only eaten Highland cattle for beef since about 1550 or 1505 or 1600. That's their choice. So that's what they've done for a long time. So you Americans should figure that out. You haven't got it right." And of course, in typical American response, it's like, "Ian, you're full of crap." He said, "Look it up, Wally." So I started to work on the question of look it up, and I did. And sure enough, Balmoral, etc., has a huge herd, not that many numbers, but a lot of Highland cows for a long time. And that is what the royal family eats. And it took him about 2 more months of getting crap from this kid that he finally fessed up and said Andy was his roommate. And his roommate just happened to be Andy, all right. It was Prince Andrew, because they always send children away to the rebellious colonies to deal with people to kind of stay tied in. Because the Queen was also the Queen of Australia, South Africa, Kenya, Belize, New Zealand, etc., Canada. So that was the first idea. So when I came back from there, we thought, let's just tinker with this. So we always been around the cattle from Herefordshire, because in Montana as a kid, there was only one kind of cow. They were red and white. And when you looked at the Black Angus cow, they looked those days, huge, thick bodies, really wired, big back, big rib eyes. But the guy I worked for when I was about 18 or 19, we ran into a black bull that came from the neighbors visiting his Herefords. And he said, the SOB had cut the legs off that bull ought to be ashamed of himself, because their heart girth was huge and their legs look so small. Well, that's what good Highlanders look like. They're not small cows. People mistake the fact that their heart girth is big from the top of their back to their belly. So their legs look shorter, but they're really not. And so Pat White was amazed the first time she came west and saw him, said, you guys put more leg under them, but you're right. Their bodies are big, but they're just taller cows by somewhat because they do have leg. Well, the reason is simple. In my world, they have to travel. We can't raise a cow on 2 acres in Montana when you get 10 inches of rain a year, and half of that is hard water, which doesn't mean it's got lime. It means it's white all winter long. It's hard water to us, which is snow. And so that's a whole different world. So that's where I learned about him. So what we ran was a big string of red Angus. So we went to Washington State and talked to Howard Lurer in Medellin Falls, who's one of the oldest Highland breeders around at the time. And here we are with cedar trees 7 foot through on the stump and 5 feet of snow, walking through Howard's cows in the field with everything plowed out. So we bought 4 cows from Howard and his cousin and thought, we're going to see what this looks like. At the same time, we met Max Beeler, who lived in Idaho Falls and Rigby, north of Idaho Falls. And Max was the ABS breeding tech for ABS breeding services for almost 35 years. He AI'd like 49,000 cows. And this guy was good. And he had always run Herefords. And then he switched to Highlanders that he liked so much. And he was crossing the Red Angus to get a polled Highlander if he could. But Max knew everything about him. So we had a lot of fun learning a ton from Max about them, why they don't AI well, why it's hard to do it, why it screws a bunch of stuff. And so he was the first guy to plug it in. But he got his first Highland cows in 1950 by driving to South Dakota in a 1949 Chevy truck. And hauling 2 Highland heifers home from South Dakota to Idaho.
In the back of the pickup?
Back of the pickup, of course, because all of us had stock racks in those days. Nobody had big horse trailers. So to haul our horses to go somewhere to ride for people, you jump your horse in the back of the pickup with the stock rack, and the horses would jump up on the back and ride. They knew what they were doing. So but can you imagine a 49 Chevy for that difference? And that's what Max did. So those guys were real education. So we took those 4 and just started running Highland cows with our Red Angus. And originally what we started doing was taking Red Angus heifers, first calvers, and crossing them Highland bulls because they calve so well. Mm-hmm. But us and the Red Angus breeders kind of rewrote the book on some of that news about that with what we learned. The first was this: I care about the mothering skill of the cow, but that isn't really the test. The Black Angus breeders, the Chianinas, all these guys, they sell cows based on the mothering skill of the cow. And what we learned from the Highlanders was what mattered was not so much the mothering skill of the cow. It's the other thing they never tell you about, which is the mothering skill of the calf. So we're up to like 80 or 90 Highlanders at the time. You'd have 3 or 4 that would be twins, or the mom didn't have enough milk, or a bad udder. So you'd graft one on a Highland cow. We trailed cows 19 miles to grass for the summer. So you're trailing 19 cows, you're trailing 400 cows, and you got all these Red Angus cows, and you got 30 Highland cows mixed in at the back to try to see if they'll breed Red Angus or not. But you've grafted some Highland cows on some of the Red Angus cows. So when you get there in a day and a half, 19 miles later, there's cows looking for their young, walking back 10 miles to mother up. The calves have tried to walk back home 12 miles. Every Highland calf that you grafted on a Red Angus cow is standing right there with its mother. Mm-hmm. So what that taught us was the mothering skill of the cow matters. But what Highlanders have that nobody else has is the mothering skill of the calf. So on first calf heifers that were Red Angus, those crosses were great because the heifer will walk away wondering what fell out of my butt. That little Highland cross calf will get up, kind of flop itself off and bawl. Weighs 52, 48, 47 pounds. The heifer will stop. The calf will stumble up there. The mom will smell it and lick it. And that calf will sure enough try to get on an udder. So we were calving 70, 80 first calf heifers a year out of Highland bulls. Guess what? We'd never touched one. That was phenomenal.
Wow.
So we learned a ton from them that way. So that's how we started running more of them. So we just kept building it up. But of course, there's not a lot of market for those. We were selling all our Red Angus calves to Nebraska corn-fed beef in Nebraska. And they contracted all of them, which was great. And we were the first people to put EIDs in them. So the electronic ear tags. So we could figure out which bull they were out of, what they were bred to. And then you would send them away. They would map them all the way through. So you got the tag number off the carcass on the rail. So we knew who the father was, who the mother was, what the weight per day of age was, what the gain was, all that stuff. So we mapped all those things and learned a ton of that from the Red Angus ones, and then figured out we were wrong. That was okay because I learned about pickups. Get in a diesel all you want, punch it to the floor. As the speedometer goes up really fast, the gas gauge goes down really fast. So the illusion was, when I was a kid, 15, 16, 17, 18, this is in the early 70s, it was a really big deal to have yearling steers that were Hereford crosses and Herefords suddenly come home in September after a year and a half out, September, October, and break 800 pounds. That was 22, 20, 19, 18, 17 months old. Now people ship calves that weigh 800 damn near. So what we forgot about is when you do early maturity, what do you do to longevity? Nobody looked at it. So everybody bred 2-year-old Herefords to calve when they were 3 when I was a kid. Now you breed yearlings to calve at 2. Well, what they never figured out is what it did to longevity. So an old black cow's did 11 maybe. Oh, we got an old black cow, she's 14. I calved 2 Highland cows last year that were 29.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
And they raised their calves just fine.
Wow.
And so if you've got teeth in them, they've been on enough grass, they're not eating sand, they whatever else, and they get enough to eat, that's decent feed. They last a long time, but they don't want to talk about that. So what the crossbreds taught us is when you cross them with the Red Angus, the most efficient, best cows I've seen are the ones that come out butterscotch. They're like the color of butterscotch candy, and they're phenomenal. They throw all red calves. So Harold Brown sent a bunch of these. I sent them back to John Ligo. They call them the redheads. We sent them a load, I think like 80 or 74 or something. He still got a couple of them. But the redheads, we calved 267 Red Angus heifers bred Highland that year. 2 had horns. The other 265 had no horns at all. out of the bunch, which is phenomenal. So that's how pure the red genes or the red Angus were. And that's how well they overrode the Highland gene deal.
Wow.
But the other thing about it is when you cross the red Angus the next time, when they're coming 3, those heifers, you can't tell their calves are a quarter red Angus until you start to grade them on the rail. Then all of a sudden, their back fat goes down, their ribeye goes up, the IMF goes up. So getting USDA prime carcasses and choice pluses is really easy to do. And they can do it faster, but they don't browse. So the cows don't last as long as the Highlanders do, but they also don't browse. So they change their diet to be more like a grazer is instead of a browser is.
Mm.
But at the same time, if people want to do it commercially, that's what we did. And we were shipping 325, 360, 310 a year to Nebraska corn-fed beef at that point. And then all of our Highlanders go to beef. So basically, we save some bulls for people like in Oregon, or some guys in Wyoming will buy it too. Stroh's buy bulls from me. That's nice. But Jack was great. And John, Jack's son, he always comes. And then David bought bulls. That's why David partly didn't get to South Dakota this summer, is because a week before South Dakota, I was hauling bulls to beat him in Wyoming to switch, because he drives halfway and I drive halfway, and we traded the parking lot. And they're good enough bulls. They're not going to tear stuff. They'll step from one trailer into the other one, and that's what you ought to have. And if you can't raise bulls like that, you got no business doing it in my world. If they're going to take you apart, they should be at McDonald's. That's why I have a flashcard in my pocket that's got little arches on it. If they have a bad day, I just show them the arches and they straighten right out, you know. I shouldn't say that, should I? But it works. So anyway, so that's how we started raising them, and that's kind of how we figured out we just did more because we started selling more and more beef. So the biggest hospital in Montana bought all their beef from us at that point.
Wow.
A third of our business was food stores and restaurants. A third of our business was hospitals and senior centers who took it, and a third of our business has always been on private people. So the restaurants, they pretty much closed. There was nobody doing this 30 years ago, 25 years ago when we started doing beef so much. Now everybody wants to knock us off, but we still cut the number of cows down. When Ann died and we sold that place and my folks needed the help and my kids didn't want to ranch full time. So we still do it, but we just cut the numbers down from a whole lot to a whole lot less. But that's all right, because it's still the same thing. And there's still, my friends tell me it's a typical deal. You grow up in Missoula, hippie people, hippie cows. And that's what they say. Because Missoula was the second most liberal city in America behind UC Berkeley in 1968. I still remember the peace marches on the river, and my hometown is the only university campus in the U.S. to this day still, when people still hold hands around the ROTC building on Kent State Day. So that's ingrained in this place big time, and that's okay. That's why I want the contract for McDonald's beef for Denver, because if I could take all the legal pot remains in Montana, feed into my cows so I have happy cows, I have the perfect ingredient for happy meals for happy beef. I just think it's a hell of a market if I can just get it going, you know?
It makes sense.
Who'd even think of that except some weird Scots cowboy in Montana, you know?
Now, Wally, we saw you out in South Dakota at the gathering, at the 75th Highland gathering out there, and you spoke. I think you've spoken at several Highland events, but we saw you speak out there, and you're very well-rounded, very well-educated, knowledgeable, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to the history of Highlands coming to the U.S. Is that something that you could talk to us about and kind of share?
Yeah, if you want, in a nutshell, here was the history that surprised a lot of people in South Dakota, I think. The reason that I learned a lot about them is the question of, it's one thing to talk about what your cows do, but even Jimmy Sitz, who raises the best Black Angus bulls in the country, didn't realize that his cows are half Highland. That shocked Sitz. He told me I was full of crap. He said it a little more bluntly than that. Well, I said, so James, tell me, how are your poor, pathetic, slick-hided, bald-headed cows today at the fair? Pretty good. You'd have thought I poked him in the gut with a sharp knife or something, you know? Wally, you're such a... But the truth of the matter is that it was really interesting to chase back through the history of the cows. And part of the influence in doing that was the fact that we'd always been kind of surprised by them, because they looked like an oryx would have looked, kind of, which sort of like with horns and hair, not as big, but they're there. So we figured some details out based on other stuff. So I grew up in western Montana, which is where the National Bison Range was. And part of the credit for saving the buffalo was Yellowstone Park and the Bison Range that was bought by the federal government in 1909. And they bought buffalo from the whole country. But before those buffalo were bought, the buffalo were actually here on the reservation. They were sold to Canada. But two people were responsible for that. Those were a gentleman named Allard and a gentleman named Pablo. And lo and behold, what they did very successfully in the early 1890s, and this was similar to what Biddle was doing in southeastern Montana, south of Miles City, et cetera, and in South Dakota, they were crossing Galloways with buffalo because they couldn't get very many Highlanders at all. But what they learned is very few of the young are sterile. Like most cows, when you cross them, are sterile. But a Wisent in Europe is a bison to us. But it's no surprise that a Wisent would have crossed well with a base cow, which is an RX basically. So Bos bison crosses with Bos primogenesis. So then we also learned along the way the difference between Bos taurus and Bos indicus is what we call Brahmins, but Bos indicus is a scientific name, but Bos indicus sweats. Bos taurus pants. That's the biggest difference in the two, which is why those cows have no hide as well. They have no hair, very little. They're disease resistant because of that where they're from, but they also are colder than hell all winter. But the difference with the Highlander is if a regular cow eats 28 pounds a day, if there's some grass around, a Highlander will do it on 20 and not lose weight. Horses always eat snow in the winter. If they're not in fresh water, fine. This drove my wife nuts when she moved from Pennsylvania and found that these guys in the West turn their horses out for the winter. What's the deal? Well, if they've got snow or water and good grass, old grass, they're fine. They did it. But what we learned about Highlanders, if they have to, they will eat water just like a horse will and not lose weight because they're putting no heat into staying warm because the hair keeps it warm. So you can have a big snowstorm in Montana and look at their back in 4 days and there's still snow in it because they're not melting it off. And I fed cows every winter for years of my life when I saw the temperature on the thermometer colder than minus 50 Fahrenheit. Not minus 50 wind chill. I'm talking minus 50 Fahrenheit. Minus 40 centigrade and minus 40 Fahrenheit are the same temperature. I have fun with the Australians and the Kiwis and the South Africans with that. I say, so how would you read the two scales, the temperature? You guys read minus 40 pretty well lately? Oh, no, there's no such temperature. Look at your thermometer. Minus 40C and minus 40F are the same. And Highlanders thrive in that. They do fine, but they also get no back fat. Because bald like guys me will tell you this. When I was like in the 5th grade, they said, if you're cold walking to school today, it was uphill both ways wearing newspapers, right? Anyway, but when you're outside in the playground, if you're cold, put on a hat. We thought that was kind of crazy, but when you get to be a certain age and the little bit of hair you have falls out, and it's not fair because it's still $20 for a haircut for me, but it's $2 for the haircut and $18 to find it. But be that is the problem. If you're cold, put on a hat. But if you want back fat, have a short-haired cow. A Highlander doesn't get the back fat because the hair keeps them warm. They don't need the fat for that. So that's part of the lesson we got out of Highlanders from the carcasses originally. And then looking at the history of them, we thought, wait a second, that's the efficiency of why the Scots did them. That's why we did with those. So the first cows probably came a backwards way. And I said this in South Dakota. The records I can find that are fairly well written down and fairly documented by the gene pool, probably the first Highlanders came to this continent with the Russians. And it's a logical thing for them to take the place they had when everybody was colonizing the world for furs and all sorts of things. They took Alaska. And they sent people to settle there, which is why there's an Eastern Orthodox church in Nome and all sorts of places. St. Petersburg, Alaska, those places have those, was because they came. Well, what'd you need to do that? You needed things that made dairy products for you. So they probably stocked at the island of Guernsey, the island of Jersey, the place in Holstein, all those places, and picked up a few dairy cattle. But when you're trading with the Scots freely from that part of Russia, and of course by the Vikings, by one saying, by the time they got done with Scotland, the Scotsman's nothing more than a short Norwegian with a really bad speech problem. But they knew how to trade with us. So it's no surprise the Russians probably picked up some Highland cows on the way. And in the process of doing that, would it surprise you? They last there well, they do great. And a woman who's a historian at University of Montana, then at USC, and did a really nice exploration study into this to try to prove it, because we got a weird phone call when I was on the ACA board in 2002 that said the president of the National Bird Foundation And the governor of Alaska and 2 senators wanted to shoot all the Highland Cross cows on 2 of the 4 islands in Alaska that have them. And we went to work and said, hell no, this is crap. This is the base gene pool. Those cows on the Kodiak Island, they've seen people a lot. Go to Andorak, go to Sandpoint, etc. It's a national bird refuge. But the cows get no feed, no nothing, no whatever else. There's no people, no interference. And they live there around bears, around people, around other stuff, and they do well. So one of my neighbors who lives down at Melrose, Montana, ranches down there, but he also has a fishing boat out of Dutch Harbor, Alaska. So he goes and fishes for 4 months a year and comes home and rents cows the rest of the time. So guess what the fishermen do when they can? When they're floating by the island with some Highland cow crosses on them, and they see one on the beach, it's amazing what a 338 does to a cow at 350 yards. And if you've got a long line seine, go into the island, hook onto that cow, pull it out to your boat, and clean it up, and that gives you a new definition of surf and turf. And they still do this to this day. So when I was in South Dakota, there were 3 people in the meeting when I talked about this that came up afterwards and said, Wally, nobody talks about it, but you're dead right. That's what all our neighbors did in Alaska. They'd go out there and poke a hole in a hairball cow because that way it's better than moose. It's whatever else. But they're not all Highland purebreds, I'm sure, but we're sure there were some there from the beginning because they were wolf-proof, they were bear-proof, they were certainly efficient, they lasted a long time. And I'm convinced their butter fat has more butter cream in it than a Jersey does, but there's not much of it. But when you milk it, when you strip a cow that's plugged up, if you start stripping Highland cows, the cream is really, really, really yellow from all the grass from the browse. But the amount of it is phenomenal given the quantity of milk you get, which is why Highland calves do okay, but there's no volume. So what we learned about the crossbreds too is that they do well with it. So we raised some Lewings for people. Mike Meyer and Kalispell had some. So part of what we learned in the history is Lewings do well, which is half milking Shorthorn and half Highland. That's the perfect homestead dairy cow. So why did the Russians do it? Would it surprise you? They needed cream, they needed butter, they needed longevity. So you take a milking Shorthorn or a milking Jersey, cross her to a Highlander, you get something with more hair, more efficiency. Unlike a Jersey, she's not going to stand on a rid and go, it's cook. I can't milk, which is what Jerseys do. Their food consumption goes like this, their milk goes like that, but not when you cross them. So Marianne Sharon down at Dillon had 2 from us that were half Jersey and half Highland, and they were winterproof, which is a real difference. So the Russians probably started it, didn't trade a lot of them, and they got bought out later, Civil War time. But when they had them, they went as far south as Northern California. The Arvers who were the coast of Oregon, the coast of Washington, most of the coast of Canada, and much of Alaska. So there were a few there. Then some, of course, came with the Scots and the Europeans. They brought a few, but not a lot, because they were not the dual-purpose cattle or the triple-purpose cattle that the cows that they called at the time Durhams. They were originally called Teeswaters because they were from the Teeswater River section. But the Teeswaters or the Durhams came, and then we call them Shorthorn. So what the Shorthorns did later, starting between 1899, 1980, 1898, and about 1910, Durhams did to the world's cows what Blank Angus did in the last 20 years. Everything. Durham Mansell is an interesting name for a cow, but we call a Durham and Mansell that because it's a cross between a French Mansell cow and a Teeswater or a Durham. When you go to the show ring and look at them, guess what they call them in the show ring? Maine Anjou. The breed is half Durham, half Mansell. Charolais were a quarter-blood Durham, all of them. Herefords had some bred in, lots of stuff did. But the Highlanders were the base cow behind the whole bunch because if you go back in the cow records and look really a long time ago in Europe, except for the ones that are both primogenesis, which is the Aurochs, the cows that seem to be there the most were horned and hairy in North Scotland. And the Scots perfected the question of beef from them in triple purpose and efficiency. Because they don't have a lot of grass, but there's a huge difference. And we finally, after running the history of them, figured out the reason they did well on the East Coast, there was lots of browse, lots of brush to eat. The people who settled there that were European wanted open ground. Chop, cut, chop, chop. But what keeps that prune down? The Highland cows do, because they browse. And what browsers are looking for, we finally figured this out. New Zealand helped me do this. And Gina's got this literature at the ACA office. It's 70 pages, but get a copy. New Zealand started doing research on their grass-fed lamb and figured out the bad flavor in grass-fed is the protein in grass, which is called scatol. The reason bear poop is called scat is the stinking bear crap is the scatol, the protein in grass. The reason venison tastes gamey is the gamey taste is the scatol. Elk never taste gamey because elk browse. Deer always taste gamey because deer graze. That's the difference. We also learned then Highlanders never taste gamey because Highlanders browse. Most cows in green grass taste gamey. They get that same icky flavor. And it's not the cow's fault. It's the grass that gives them the scatol flavor. And the antidote for the scatol is condensed tannins. And the only thing that gets tannins naturally is a browser. In New Zealand, they get rid of the tannins in their lambs by dosing them 60 days before they kill them with a huge squirt gun in their mouth of condensed tannins. The tannins strip the scatol. But if you have a browser that eats brush, the rose bushes, your wife's tulips, the lilacs of the neighbors, all these things that make you so popular in your neighborhood at home, when they eat all that stuff, that's the antidote for the scatol, so they never taste gamey. So I kill grass-fed cattle at Dell at 6,236 feet above sea level every 2 weeks, year-round, off grass, free-ranged. Wow. And I still do it here outside Missoula at Beavertail, but it's only 3,500 feet above sea level here. But I still kill them all the time, off grass, free-range. Never saw grain, don't know what it is. And a lot of those, they all grade USDA Choice Plus. And if I really want to let one go and get a little piggy looking to my eye, they'll go USDA Prime, and we can get a USDA Prime with 1/4 of an inch of back fat. So when you get that much fat on their back, you get a USDA Prime based on ribeye size and the amount of IMF, which is intermuscular fat, in a ribeye. You've got it right. And they'll do it, but you got to keep them longer. So steers don't die very well at 25, 30, 36, 38, 40. 40 months, you got to be able to kill a steer, and they're not hard-boned. They don't have the extra teeth that drives the USDA nuts. They're not worn down. So every time Aka tries to push the window, I unpush the window and say, no, I don't want to be breeding yearly heifers. I want them to last to age 25. Mm-hmm. What we learned in Black Angus, Red Angus, Herefords, Galloways, all the rest is when you speed them up, you take the longevity off. So that's who started, I think, was the Russians. Who then brought more was, of course, the Scots, because they knew from the old country what they do. But then things started to change in the 1700s with them, because the new picture of all the women painted in Europe all have a lot of weight on. Marl, the Old English word for fat. And Highlanders don't get the marl on the outside as fat because they have the hair. They don't need the back fat. They don't want that because it's too hot, too warm, too whatever else. So that changed the deal somewhat there. But there were some on the East Coast for a long time. Some people in the West who settled here realized that there was hope for those because they were all cattlemen. So what I said in South Dakota, I'd say today, if you look at the record of the names you know from 1850 on that were in the cattle business in the western half of the U.S., what you'll find is virtually every damn one is a Scotsman, almost everyone. They did it well, starting in 1600, 1550, 1650. There's a good record of trailing cattle to London for beef. And they did it there well. Some of the drover trails are still there. They were drovers. And that's where the words came from. They drove the cattle. That's what it was called. And we were on a cattle drive, but they were called the drover. And when the cattle came to London, they came how? In droves, which is where that's the term came from. Mm. There were droves of them who came up the road. We speak the language. We just forgot where we got the words. But they went outside London, where they fed them brassicas, which are the root crops, turnips, parsnips, etc., those things, rutabagas, whatever else. They ate lots of those, and they still will if you make them available. I know a lot of people in the East get them to eat those, and they do it well. However, there were also manuring fields by doing that. But the butchers in London did not have a butcher store or meat store or grocery store. They had an abattoir or a meat shop. And that's what they had. But when they ran out of stuff that was fresh or hanging or aged enough to hang, they had to go pick up store cattle or store sheep or store lambs, which is where the term came from. So store cattle were in the fields around London or the fields around Manchester, eating brassicas in the field, etc. Some grain, but not a lot of brassicas and grass. And that's what they did to get those in. So that's part of the reason why they brought some to this country too, because they realized they were good beef, they were efficient, you could use them, but they weren't as good at milking, and they were harder to handle in terms of driving them for ox teams because of the horns. So a lot of people wanted to fight that question. So the Durhams took off, and there was a lot of those, but the people who brought some later, the Biddle ended up with a few out of Indiana, and the rest were all people who were Scots who came. So here's the story. If you look at the history of the drovers in the West, every cow trail you know just about is named for a Scotsman. Granville Stewart was a Scots boy. There it went. John Chisholm was a breed, as they called him at the time. He was Scots and Indian, but he was a Scotsman. The drovers out of Texas, virtually all of them, John Chisholm, Scotsman as well. Okay, William Clay, Bill McTeague, William Tisdale, John MacDonald, Agnes MacDonald, Joe McKay, virtually all those people were Scotland. The book Making a Fortune in the West, The Great American Beef Industry, was published in 1880, Go West, Young Man, written by Murdo Mackenzie, who also incorporated in Aberdeen, Scotland, what became the largest ranch in America. And it still exists, and it has only a 3-letter brand that talks about who formed it and what they owned. 10 partners in Edinburgh and Dundee incorporated it, and they own 10 entire townships in the state of Texas in one block. And the brand on the side of those cows to this day is Roman numeral 10 IT, which in English is XIT. And they had all the grass in Montana from the Yellowstone to the Missouri, which is bigger than the state of North Carolina. That was their grass by 1885. And everybody who worked for them came from the old country, and they were almost all Scotsmen, which is why if you go to the Northern Pacific shipping records after 1892 or 3, you'll find that virtually all the records from 1895 to 1910 or 12 you can't read. They counted every cow and every sheep that was shipped, and they incorporated it all in the records of the Northern Pacific Railroad. They're not written in English. They're written to the language they spoke, which was Gaelic, because they were all Scotsmen who came. What they also didn't talk about was the other part of the story, which was that was a 2-way shipping point. Look at the records of Glendive, Miles City, Cody, Billings, etc. They counted out 77,000 steers in 1887, 2.5 years after the Northern Pacific started. 77,000 steers to butcher went east. Those are almost all 4 years old or so. And 88,267 yearlings came back to the west for grass to grow up. There were no trail drives in big numbers from Texas. There were a few to Wyoming, but not a lot. What we had later was the rail trains did it both ways. So we were running basically a grass free-range feedlot in the west called free-range beef to grow them up. So we took the cattle from the Midwest, brought them here, and that's what we did, but they were all Scots boys who did it. So that was the history. So from being something the Queen had and royalty had that were English that bought land in Scotland or got sent there to break the Scots, etc., they kept some Highland cows because they were pretty. Marl became the issue we want, so then we went after the fat, which is why in 1806 they started to recognize this pole-slick-hided, semi-bald cow called an Angus cow. Showed the first ones in 1824 at the London Fair. But the breed was basically something that didn't exist before then. They were all brindle, and they were called either cows that were either Humleys or dowded cattle. So I'm a dowded man, which means not that I don't have horns, I don't have hair. But if you're dowded or a Humley, that's what you were. They were all brindle. Then over an issue called a tryst or a spraith, which in Scotland was the way you didn't like your neighbor, and that clan was not so nice. So you didn't steal their cows. You just borrowed them. For a while, not very long, because we don't like them. And a lot of cattle were horn branded. I have 2 of the heads laying around that Walter Hill brought when he imported all the cows in 1928 from Scotland, which is the biggest exportation of Highland cattle in one bunch in history. They came to Livingston, Montana. Those cattle were horn branded. The brand of the cows is on their horn, not on their hide. And so they couldn't do that with the black cows and the red cows so well. They had to then, because they were polled, because they were Angus, became known as that. So what they did with those is they sorted for color, because the McIntosh clan hated the Aberdeen clan, and the McIntosh boys kept stealing their cows. They weren't stealing them. They were just trusting them. It was a spray. And then at the same time, the Aberdeen clan didn't like the McIntosh boys, so they returned the same favor, which is the reason why from those cute little, likely good brindle cattle, the Aberdeen boys kept the ones they liked more that were black, because the McIntosh boys couldn't take them away. And the McIntosh boys kept the Aberdeen cattle out of their herd because their cows were mostly red, because the Aberdeen boys couldn't take them away because they were the wrong color. So it's a funny deal how taxes and color still drive the bus starting in 1825 or so. And here we are 200 years later doing the same damn thing. Just we haven't come very far, have we? But what they did from those is some people collected big herds. So Biddle had a large number of them. They went to various places. He accumulated cattle from Indiana, parts of Montana. Some came out of Oregon, some came from southern Canada. Who put some in Canada was the Hudson Bay Trading Company, because they worked fairly well for a Red River cart, which is one ox pulling your cart across the country with two wheels and cart side. Cows were more efficient. They didn't go as far in a day. They got by on a better diet than a horse did. They weren't as hard to maintain. But at the end of the day, they were a lot nicer to have around because you didn't feel so bad about eating them. So that was the other thing. There was this sort of cultural innuendo about don't eat your horse unless you're French. But the rest of us didn't eat our horses for the most part. We ate cows, and that's what the thing was. So that's what we did with them. So then by the 10s, the 1910, 1915, 1920, there was some interest, but the interest was these are interesting cows and they're pretty. And what really turned that around was in the 30s when the Breeders' Gazette picked up the story of Walter Hill, the importation of those cows. He bought everything that was for sale that was of quality in Scotland, including the entire open sale in like 27 and 28 or 26 and 27. But there were these great write-ups in the Breeders' Gazette about, why do we have these cows grazing in the beautiful pastures of the Adirondacks? And from that lesson came the question of these are pretty cows, we should have them. And who ends up with some of those cattle at Twin Bridges, Montana after the Second World War? The Von Trapp family, which is on the East Coast now. But they were originally at Twin Bridges in Whitehall, Montana, with a ranch there. That's what they did. They had some Highland cows, and they kept them on the east. Other families, whether it's DuPont's, Conoco, etc., picks them up. Other big families had some, and some people kept them otherwise. But there weren't a lot of breeders. And then some people in the West had a few, including Stroh's kept some. And then when Wendell Berry's family, etc., Baxter Berry and the rest picked some up, decided let's make an association. And while there's a note that says, well, Tom Berry talked about doing that, he was the governor of South Dakota, but actually it wasn't really his idea first. It was actually Walter Hill, who was James and Mary's Hill's son, who had all these Highland cows at Livingston, Montana. And one of his things in his interview in the Breeders' Gazette is he looks forward to the day when he says there can be a Highland register for these cows in America. And sure enough, he got his wish done at the first meeting when ACA got formed. And that was nice, but he unfortunately passed away before it got done and got in a huge fight with his ranch foreman who ate a lot of the cows. But some of the rest of them made it and got dispersed, so they ended up with people on the West Coast, Stroh's. Howard Lohr got some of them. They ended up going to Berry's. The reason why the first recorded cows in the ACA book say Red Hill, Green Hill, Blue Hill, those cows all came from Walter Hill's herd, most of which came from Scotland. So the history is all tied together in terms of what they did. That's why the Montana State University livestock judging team judged Highlanders from the state farm until the 1960s, because they kept some of them still that Hills had given to the university when they passed away, etc. So they still ran those. So I've got guys who are 85 years old now or more who tell me, this was amazing. We were judging these fuzzball cows of yours, Wally, in 1965 when we were on the meat judging team for Montana State University. And I smile and say it was Montana State College, then don't forget it. But anyway, it was the Ag College and they had them. So from that lesson of they went from pretty to practical, then what they started to make the change back to pretty. So now people keep them because they're basically lawn poodles. That's what we call them. Everybody wants a lawn poodle or a grass poodle. That's okay. But at the same time, they're functionally great, but we keep them because they're the best beef there is. They truly are a browser. So we made the cycle from pretty to functional. The Russians thought they were functional. The Scots who brought them kept them that way. The guys in Alaska still have them on the islands up there. And we've now made the journey partly back to pretty, but there's 4 or 5 of us in the country still who raise them for the purpose of what they were built for, which is beef and efficiency. And I think the last count I had, there's only 4 of us in the country who can load more than 2 semis with Highland calves on any given day and ship them. I used to be able to the point I could like 6 or 7 or 8 semis with Highland calves and ship them. But you can still do it. There's some of us who can, and we do, and we don't register a lot of cows because when you're going to kill all of them and spay heifers that have a bad attitude or they're not good enough to really keep because they got problems with too narrow, not deep enough, legs are wrong, whatever else, bad temperament, bad attitude, fine, we spay a lot of those. So I should go back to registering more cows from the registered cows I still have. I just haven't done a lot because we kill most of the ones we have for beef, which is how we pencil staying in the cow business. But I hope that gives you an idea of the history and what they do. But we know a lot about their history because of the people we met And if you look at the old breeders, every one of them basically I met. Howard Lohr, Max Beeler, Jack Stroh, the guys from Wyoming who had him so long, Guthrie's, Baxter Berry's family. I know a couple of the Berries over the years I met. One teaches at Kentucky still, etc. But those were interesting people to visit about what it was like so many years ago. And two of the three boys who came with the Scots cows at Walter Hillbrook in 1928, I met in the 1970s. They stayed in this country. They lived at White Sulphur Springs. I had no idea what they'd done, what they accomplished, but they both had the accent from the old country skull. They were both in their 80s at the time when I met them in the 70s. And they talked about it themselves and their dogs and what they still did. But I never realized they were part of the people that when Walter Hill bought the cows, the boys came with them. And I would give anything to go back to all those years to the 70s when I met them to get the stories and write it down. But I didn't know at the time. I was a punk teenager or a punk college kid at the time, so you don't know. But I wish I would have. But I did meet two of the three boys who came personally.
Wow. Well, Wally, I'm glad that we're recording this conversation with you because in 20 years, I don't want to say, man, I wish I would have. I wish I would have written down what Wally would have told us. So this is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Happily. Thank you.
I feel like there's probably at least 4 or 5 podcasts in there that I could just pull out and we could just talk about for an hour each. But a lot of good information. I definitely want to talk. We want to talk with you further about other topics in the future. Just the browser versus grazer. Just that, I feel like we could do a whole podcast on that. Kimber and I raised our first Highland steer this year, and just the meat quality, the marbling that you're talking about, the back fat, it's amazing. I could sit here and pick your brain for several more hours, but we'll wrap this one up. Wally, thank you so much. It's an honor to sit down with you and just to get to know you better. We had a quick conversation out in South Dakota last year, and it wasn't enough. So I'm glad you're willing to sit down with us and talk to us again.
Anytime, happily. And usually I get to the stock show, but I haven't made it for 3 years because I keep ending up doing water cases. And I'm one of these days going to quit doing so much of that. And then when I do have enough time to go to the stock show, I win every year, 20 years in a row, though.
Wow. Well, hopefully next year we'll be there. We're planning on being there. So hopefully next year, maybe we can pick your brain at the stock show next year in person.
Anytime. But I hope this helps because it's a piece of history and it matters a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it needs to be something that is recorded, whether it's written down or on a Zoom interview, but it's something that needs to be that people can go back to and listen to. And we need to keep this knowledge and this education moving forward. So again, really appreciate you sitting down with us. Listeners, if you want to get a hold of Wally, you definitely can. He said he's willing to speak with anybody that has questions. You can contact Wally probably through us is probably the best way at this point. Our email will be at the end of this episode, so look for that. And then if you want to get in contact with Wally, we can make that happen. So thanks again, Wally.